Senior Captain Zhang, you might want to help us to understand why China is busy deploying land-to-air missiles in the Xisha Island.
Well, first of all, I want to say that the Xisha Islands are an inherent part of China's territory, so it is national and also legitimate for China to deploy limited defense weapons and facilities on these islands. This action is blameless and falls within China's sovereign rights and international law.
What have been those weapons for? Targeting at whom?
Well, I think it doesn't has any specific target. It is natural for any country to deploy defensive weapons on their islands. They are just aimed at better protecting China's sovereignty and security.
Okay, we hear from the Chinese side. What about from the U.S. side? Mr. Paal, there has been a lot of discussion about what are those for? Those U.S. military planes and also ships in the territory which many countries consider as sensitive. What are they for?
Well, it's hard to say. We have a situation where China says too little about what its intentions are, and in America we say too much about everything we see. The consequence has been that people watch the incremental developments, whether in the Xisha Paracel Islands or in the Spratly Nansha Islands, and see an incremental approach that China is trying to militarize the entire South China Sea. China has not stated what its ultimate objective is. It's been very obtuse about this, and therefore people who are suspicious of China project the worst image that they can imagine.
And therefore, what are the U.S. warships and military aircraft in the region for? That's also my question to you, sir.
Well, they're there because, one, the local countries with which we have good relations have asked us to be there. Two, the U.S. on principle throughout the world conducts freedom of navigation exercises. Those have come under greater pressure politically in the U.S. because there's a suspicion that China is trying to close off the South China Sea. Not today, not tomorrow, but pretty soon. And therefore the argument is that if the U.S. doesn't keep those passageways open, China will close them.
All right. Mr. Yang here in Beijing. Well, does China have a hidden agenda, as Mr. Paal suspected earlier? And also, what does China think about so-called freedom of navigation from the U.S. side?
Well, I should say by this way, on one hand, China has a modernization plan, as everyone knows, including military modernization. Regarding to the weapon deployment on Xisha Island and Nansha Island, it has been years. For example, many years ago, the PLA deployed anti-aircraft guns at that time. But now we modernized, upgrade to missile. It's natural. It's a natural course for every sovereign state. And on the other hand, in recent years, U.S. speed up their militarization by sending more and more frequently aircraft and warships, like my friend Doug Paal pointed out, under requirement of the neighboring countries. That regarded by China as a changing position of American policies. That was take no position on the dispute. But now U.S. began to take a position, especially take a position by military means. That for China is really militarization. China has to do some reaction.
Well, Mr. Paal, you know, it seems that China believes it is natural evolution of the weapons on Xisha and Nansha Islands. And second, U.S. might, from China's perspective, begin this so-called arms race in the region. At least that's what some of the Chinese pilots with us believe. How do you respond?
Well, I'm a specialist on this region, and I see the arguments on both sides on a regular basis. And both sides have some merit to the cases that they make. What we have here really is the emerging security dilemma, where China does something which it believes is defensive in nature, and it's perceived by its neighbors as potentially offensive. And then we, on the other side, do something we perceive as defensive, and China perceives it as offensive. Another example would be in South Korea, where the U.S. believes it has to defend itself against North Korean missiles by deploying THAAD, and China sees the THAAD air defense system as offensive against China's capabilities. We need our leaderships to sit down together and give each other some reassurances about what their long-term intentions are. China has a big gap in its explanation for what the 9-dash line means and what it intends to do about enforcing the territorial claims in the South China Sea as a start.
Mr. Zhang, Senior Captain, is it a perspective issue?
Well, I think there are 2 points in this question. First, I agree with Mr. Paal that China has never and now is not blocking the passage of free trade or the passage of any vessels in the South China Sea. And I don't think the United States should make its decision or judgment on hypothesis that China will probably in the future block the passage. This is only a hypothesis. So just on this hypothesis, on the basis, the United States is sending its warplanes and aircraft into the territorial waters of China in the South China Sea. It's ridiculous.
And what about the perspective issue? You believe that's only hypothesis. It is not reality, and yet U.S. has already taken action.
And also, the Xisha Island is totally different from the Nansha Islands. We know that China has administered and controlled the Xisha Island for a long time, and there's no dispute over the Xisha Island. And I think the United States is trying to provoke tensions in this area, and so as to meddle in the South China Sea issue and maintain its leadership in this region.
Okay, that is perspective from both sides. What about history? Mr. Paal already mentioned the 9-dash lines. That has been a topic that's been discussed for decades, if not longer. Can we be able to solve it, 9-dash line, at this moment during the intense discussion about who is militarized, quote unquote, the region?
Well,
or is it going to make things even worse, more difficult?
2 long words to talk about history, but just one simple fact. In 1947, after World War II, when Japanese returned all islands in South China Sea to China, and at that time, Chinese government had no capability to send troops on the major island of Nansha Islands. It was the United States Navy that helped the Chinese Navy send troops on the Taiping Island. That is the key island. That's just like a master room in the house. The master room occupied and returned to China. That means the whole house returned to China. That is history. So when I really agree with my friend say, both Chinese and the American top leaders should sit down, seriously talk about the dash line and everything else surrounding the South China Sea.
But what if they cannot reach any conclusion? Is this tension continue to appear in front of us, which is likely to be the case, that it's not easy to reach a conclusion. Even with the top leadership are sitting down with one another.
I don't expect the top leader of the 2 sides can reach some agreement or consensus. However, at least at the top level, they can make a strategic transparency that can reduce mutual suspicions. For example, U.S. Absolutely suspicious about China's capability to block the area. And Xi Jinping can make just like a strategic reassurance. And also, China has a maybe stronger suspicion about American warships. And President Obama should give some transparency and reassurance.
Well, you already mentioned a very sensitive figure, President Obama, because this is a political figure inside the United States who would stay in the office for another couple of months before he leaves. And Mr. Paal, you know this better than I do. You're based in Washington, campaign season up, and also even during the transitional year, let's just say next year, it's going to be still difficult to figure out clear policies from the American politics toward this part of the world. What do you think about the possibility, as you earlier suggested, Mr. Paal, that the 2 top leadership sit down with one another, give reassurances to one another?
Well, that's an important objective. It may be difficult under the circumstances. I think Senior Captain Zhang has made a very important point about transparency. one of the reasons that we have this discussion this morning is that the Western world was surprised when it was discovered that missiles were placed in the Xisha Paracel Islands. If China had made a programmatic statement about its plans for upgrading defenses in the islands and just published it in its own newspapers, the world would not have been surprised by this development, and then you wouldn't get uninformed reactions from people like the Secretary of State, who was asked about it without expectation at a press conference and gave a response which was based not on the new facts but on his observation of President Xi Jinping's visit in Washington last year, when President Xi said he had no intention of militarizing the Nansha Spratly Islands. And they were confusing the Xisha and the Nansha in this case. But the long-term intention is still murky, and that's where transparency will help. Senior Captain Zhang has made a very important point. We need to be more transparent, even if our leaders can't sit down and reassure each other. But if on the basis of transparency, we might get to better reassurances.
All right. Earlier you said it's probably a perspective issue, and now one more question about transparency. But is transparency likely to solve the problem if political leadership at the very top from both countries not likely to act, or at least listen to one another very closely? Will the military be able to be transparent one step further, Mr. Zhang?
Well,
Senior Captain Zhang, I want to have your opinion.
Well, I think China has been transparent on the South China Sea issue. First, on the Xisha Island, China says that the deployment of limited defense weapons is just for defensive, to safeguard China's sovereignty. On the Nansha Islands, China's construction activities are mainly for civilian purposes. I think the United States should listen to China about what it is saying.
Mr. Paal, why can't United States listen to China? Senior Captain Zhang is complaining certainly here in our Beijing studio. Can you?
I don't know if you've lost contact with me or not.
We have you. We have you here, sir.
Okay, thank you. The U.S. is responding to new events for which they were unprepared. There was no earlier reference to this development and no explanation to the government, and therefore they responded based on the most recent developments, as I mentioned in the September meeting here in Washington with the two presidents. This is a problem of getting ahead of the news, not letting the news be made by outside sources. This is a bigger problem every day with all of the social media and alternative sources of information that pop up in public consciousness before officials have a chance to understand and relate policy to these developments.